Hi everyone, my name is David Bateman-Sheeler. As a student in Florida State University's History and Philosophy of Education Master's program, this semester, the fall of 2021, I took Politics of Education with Dr. Carolyn Harrington. Within Dr. Harrington's course, I was asked to prepare an 18 to 20 page paper on a topic of my choosing within the field of educational politics. Now, I think it's important before I get too far into this video that you know that as a History and Philosophy of Education master's student, policy creation and implementation and policy analysis in general are not my driving interests. That is not to say I'm not interested in the politics of education, quite the opposite. However, my approach to the politics of education comes from my academic position within the history and philosophy of education, not educational policy evaluation, as it does with many of my class peers. For those who choose to read my paper, you will find citations from educational philosophers, historians, and even political philosophers, where I suspect the majority of my class peers use skills from their doctoral research methods coursework and focus their research on a narrower topic. As a master's student, I'm still quite content providing a more generalist or survey approach to my work. With these disclaimers behind us, let's jump on in. For my topic, I chose to discuss the politics of laboratory schools as it relates to stakeholder theory, as proposed by Freeman and Reed in 1983, and applied within educational politics by Ehrensal and First in 2008, as well as conceptions of governance, namely integrative and aggregative conceptions introduced by March and Olsen in 1989, and brought into the field of education by Scribner, Aleman, and Maxcy in 2003. The paper and this presentation are formatted using the same structure. Today, I will discuss, in the context of laboratory schools, what are schools and for whom? Whose interests are served and whose interests should be served? And what is the nature of stakeholder relationships? Let's start by taking a minute to introduce the concepts of stakeholder theory and conceptions of governance. I'll also provide a brief history of laboratory schools, including their relationships to the broader charter school movement. Stakeholder theory is a theory of organizational management and ethics. That is, the subject matters of the theory are inherently moral or political topics. The authors share that stakeholders are those groups who have a stake in the actions of the school organization, as well as those groups without whose support the organization would cease to exist. Ultimately, stakeholder theory maintains that the objectives of the school organization should be derived by balancing the conflicting claims of the various stakeholders of the organization. Some examples of stakeholders include governmental agencies, employees, parents, students, and local taxpayers. Stakeholder theory helps people understand who and what may be influencing a political decision-making process. However, it is conceptions of governance that clarify who will make the decisions as well as how they will be made. There are two conceptions of governance introduced by Scribner, Aleman, and Maxcy that are significant to laboratory school politics. As mentioned earlier, these are integrative and aggregative conceptions. The integrative conception is deductive, while the aggregative conception is inductive. Because of this paradigmatic difference, integrative governance is preferred by highly professionalized, sometimes bureaucratic, political groups, whereas aggregative governance is more closely aligned to deliberative democracy, with many people providing their input. Because of the diversity of people who are included in providing input, aggregative governance is preferred by non-professionalized, non-experts, sometimes called lay people. The process of aggregating public opinion often necessitates a greater bureaucratic structure, although sometimes this is not true, such as in the case of co-opted populism. With stakeholder theory and the two conceptions of governance introduced, I will quickly cover a brief history of laboratory schooling in the United States. The first laboratory schools were known as model, practice, and training schools. They first appeared in the United States with the emergence of normal schools at the beginning of the 19th century. The unifying theme to all model, practice, training, and later experimental, laboratory, and professional development schools is the development of future teachers and the teaching profession. Laboratory schools, as well as experimental schools, focus most heavily on researching and demonstrating educational best practices. Laboratory schools, including model, practice, training, experimental, and professional developmental schools, peaked between 1970 and 1990, with over 200 university or college-operated schools. Today, it's necessary to count either laboratory schools or university or college-operated schools. This is because beginning in the 1990s, a new model of school began to grow in popularity, including with colleges and universities. This new model is charter schools. Charter schools were first proposed in a research presentation by Ray Budd in 1974. 14 years later, with no traction on the idea of charters, and after being inspired to further encourage educational reform by the publication Nation at Risk, Ray Budd wrote Education by Charter, Restructuring School Districts in 1988. The book gained attention of key stakeholders within teachers' unions and reform lobbyist groups, and in 1991, Minnesota became the first state to authorize a charter school. By 2012, there were nearly 6,000 charter schools in the United States, educating more than 2 million students annually. And while it may seem that the stories of charter schools and laboratory schools are separate stories, they are not. Through the 1990s, many existing laboratory school laws were duplicated, expanded, and revised to create new state charter school regulations. In some cases, given a positive track record of operating a school, colleges and universities even became charter school authorizers and sponsors. Florida is a great example of this. Florida opened its first university-run laboratory school in 1934. In 1991, with almost 60 years of successful institutional experience, the Florida legislature qualified all then-existing laboratory schools as independent school districts of choice. School choice was a forerunner policy to charter schools in many states. By 1996, Florida passed its first charter school law, and similarly established the authority for colleges and universities to sponsor, but not yet authorize, a limited number of charter schools each. With only a small hiccup in 2006 when Florida attempted to create a central charter school authorization board, which was quickly defeated in the Florida lower courts for being in contest with constitutional authority of local school districts, Florida has found a good deal of success with charter laboratory schools. More than one of the state's 2019 top 10 performing schools in the elementary, middle, and high school levels were university-run laboratory charter schools. As of June of 2021, Florida has passed legislation that now allows universities and colleges, in select cases, to also act as charter school authorizers. Okay, so I've covered stakeholder theory, conceptions of governance, and a brief background on laboratory and charter schools. Now, let's get to applying these ideas within the three guiding questions. As a reminder, they are, what are schools, and for who? Whose interests are served, and whose interests should be served? And finally, what is the nature of stakeholder relationships? When looking specifically at laboratory schools, and using some of the history that was not covered in this brief video, the research, development, and demonstration objectives, as established by the college and university researchers, is the prevailing function. Of course, beneath these objectives are subsequent objectives for the research, development, and demonstration, likely related to student learning. In the paper, this section goes further to discuss literature which associates some stakeholders with other objectives or functions. If the function of laboratory schools is most significantly informed by the professional researcher stakeholder group, then it follows that their interests are most well served. While this is true, additional literature, specifically from work on school, university, community collaborative relationships, sometimes also called community schools or wraparound schools, made clear the importance of collaboratively synthesizing multiple stakeholder interests in pursuit of the greatest potential outcomes for any one stakeholder. Crossing into the nature of stakeholder relationships within laboratory charter schools, I want to be honest that this section of the analysis became a bit inferential given the incredible degree of overlap and interaction between stakeholder groups. Most importantly, I return to the importance of balancing the many conflicting interests of stakeholders expected within stakeholder theory. This most important note pairs nicely with the encouragement of collaboration taken from the community school stakeholder literature, which was just discussed. Finally, then, it is possible to analyze the political process qualities, the relationship qualities, of educational administration within laboratory schools, by way of the conceptions of governance. As highly professionalized institutions led by a professional stakeholder group, laboratory schools are prone to integrative governance. That is sometimes expeditious, sometimes routinized or standardized, and almost always exclusive to the wishes of the lay majority. For this reason, it is unsurprising to find a recurrent theme in laboratory school improvement recommendations. Invest in inter-stakeholder relationships, most often specifically naming parents and family. Despite the political interwovenness of modern laboratory schools as the broader charter school movement, laboratory integrative governance is contrasted by the much more aggregative approach of charter schools. Knowing of these institutional types' interwoven political history, this disconnect is alarming. However, upon closer inspection, the contemporary charter school is philosophically quite separated from its origin. Even by 1996, Ray Budd expressed concern that his idea had been, quote, pushed in another direction. Two authors, Kallenberg and Potter, in 2014, writing on behalf of the American Federation of Teachers, which fueled early policy interest in chartering, shared, quote, somewhere along the way, charter schools went in a very different direction from the one 1988 AFT President Shanker originally envisioned. Looking deeper into early documents of chartering, it becomes clear that teachers, via unions, were intended to be a much larger driving force in establishing experimental charters to test new curricular approaches and pedagogies without immediate professional concern related to the risk associated with educational experimentation. Had this occurred, then charters today would look much more like the professionalized and integratively governed laboratory schools. Of course, it's not enough to leave discussion at professionalism equals integrative governance and at times a dismissive quality to non-professional stakeholders. So, in the closing pages of my paper, I discuss a potential policy reform effort, namely, a return to the originally proposed experimental charter concept. Except, instead of being accountable to a local school board, which is often composed primarily of non-professional or lay persons, or a central state board, conversely professional, to have all chartered schools report and remain accountable to a new, local, and balanced lay professional board, itself accountable to the nearest authorizing college or university. This college or university would remain accountable to a reconsolidated P20 Board of Education, at least in the case of Florida. Together, these reforms could instill a spirit of aggregative democracy via much clarified electoral responsiveness, necessary to counteract any professional preference for integrative governance, as well as increase access to important stakeholder resources present on most colleges and university campuses. Further, institutionalizing the expectation that newly created and balanced local boards represent a cross-section of stakeholders avoids stakeholder balkanization and breakdown of deliberative processes central to the resistance of elitist integrative governance, which might otherwise emerge due to the greater involvement of research professionals in what are, in the present unreformed world, lay-dominated charter schools. In review, today's video presented the main points of my end-of-term paper for Politics of Education taught by Dr. Carolyn Harrington in the fall of 2021. It was discussed that laboratory schooling is primarily directed at research, development, and demonstration of innovative and high-quality educational practices. Being led by professional stakeholders, laboratory schools are expectedly governed through an integrative approach, especially when compared to their non-laboratory charter school peer institutions, which have a hypothesized proclivity for aggregative governance. The difference in these governance styles was then related to inter-stakeholder relations. Finally, a rough sketch of a potential reform effort was given, such that the laboratory school concept could be drastically expanded. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment below.